So, hi there. My name is Phillida Swift. My pronouns are she, her. My visual description is that I have mid-length brown hair. I have olive skin, a facial scar. I'm wearing a pink jumper and gold jewelry. I am the CEO of a charity called Face Equality International, and we are here today to present to you all on a stigmatized identity that to date there's still very much a lack of research on. Most importantly, though, we want to seek the expertise of this community on counteracting stigma. Much like many other stigmatized identities, facial difference is a human experience that, unless it directly affects you or a family member, you might have never really thought about it. And what even is a facial difference? Well, it's a mark, scar, or condition which is either acquired, like mine. It is something that someone could have been born with, such as a cleft or another craniofacial condition, or it could be something that comes and goes, like a skin condition. I will now hand over to my fellow panelists for each of their introductions. So first off on my screen is Rashira.
Hello, everyone. As my colleague Phillida has stated, my name is Rashira Dobson. My pronouns are she, her. For a brief visual description, I am a Black woman. I have short, medium hair. I am wearing a burgundy scarf and I have on gold earrings. And I will pass it on to my colleague, Marisa.
Hi everyone, I'm Marissa. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a Mexican American woman with long, wavy brown hair and a facial difference on my left eye, and I'm wearing a purple sweater. So I will pass it on to Dr. Gray.
Hi everyone, I'm Jazz Gray. My pronouns are she, her. I am a Black woman with braids that are in a ponytail today. I have on a brown sweater, gold jewelry, and a blazer that has multiple colors in it. And I'm excited for all of us to gather for this engaging conversation with my friends and colleagues. Back to you, Alita.
Thank you so much, everybody. So before we launch into the panel discussion, I'll provide a short bit of context as to why we're here today and what we at Face Equality International are currently doing to address the stigma surrounding disfigurement. It is with thanks to a member of our community, Charlene Pell, that we're here today. She runs an organisation called Facing Forward, which has previously developed workshops around staring, which is a common experience for people with burns and other disfiguring conditions. She attended this conference last year and said, you need to do something on disfigurement, hence why we are here. So, facial difference, it represents a human experience which comes with many prejudices that are associated with day-to-day life and the discrimination that comes with that, whether that is bullying, hate crime out on the streets. Here in the UK, a third of people with disfigurements have been a victim of a hate crime, a lack of opportunity in the workplace, ineffective equality laws, or the burden of navigating an ableist and appearance-obsessed healthcare system. The research that does exist to date is very much focused on self-stigma, so internalized stigma and the associated psychosocial challenges that can come from living with a facial difference in an appearance-obsessed global society. This can reinforce that medical model, that burden on the individual to have to overcompensate, to have to cope with a stigmatizing world, which is effectively where the work of Face Equality International comes in, to really shift that focus onto making society a better place. So reducing that public stigma through shifting societal attitudes, through eradicating stigmatizing systems of oppression. And we build capacity for service delivery organizations wanting to advocate for face equality in line with their existing programs, be them medical, psychosocial, financial, any kind of support that currently exists for someone with a facial difference. Now, this past year, we set out to better understand the experience of stigma surrounding disfigurement in low to middle income countries. Findings from that pilot were conducted through interviews with families who are affected by facial difference. We also spoke with healthcare professionals, social workers, charity workers, government officials. And as I'm sure you'll know, the findings were quite enlightening, and they really were quite different depending on which group of people we spoke to. So in Mexico, we found that public stigma and poor treatment from families and immediate communities is hugely prevalent and can often show up in the form of bullying, ostracization, which can sometimes result in child abuse, children being hidden away. We even heard of children being kept in cages. We heard of teachers who simply did not know how to teach a child with a facial difference. And often teachers could even be the perpetrators of bullying or other stigmatizing behaviors. And this then led to children being forced out of school and missing out on an education. Fortunately, younger generations of parents in Mexico currently are less likely to believe long-standing kind of superstitions or supernatural causes of facial difference. That said, the kind of culture of guilt and blame, which disproportionately affects women, still remains. There are beliefs that clefts are caused by the moon, for example, or as a result of sin or wrongdoing, and this is pervasive. There are some positive shifts with younger generations, but what remains is this culture that is very gendered. And there is this sense that the woman is always to blame somehow for having a child who is born with a facial difference. That said, there is a really kind of empowering positive movement in Mexico, which focuses on centering the medical and social needs of the facial difference community. This is something that people really want, but the resources to deliver it are limited, and government support is also very much minimal. There could be benefits in aligning with disability movements in Mexico, but pervasive ableism and a sense of distancing from disability movements could inhibit progress. Couple that with the fact that facial difference is not universally regarded as a disability in Mexico or in anywhere currently in the world. And we have a problem where many people are falling through the gaps of the system. There is a high cost attached to seeking medically necessary treatment in Mexico and in other low to middle income countries across the world. And these are necessary to enable a child to eat, to safely breathe, to perhaps even hear. And there is a gap between where facial differences should be considered temporary disabilities, which is ultimately leading to infant deaths due to malnutrition, infection, or in the worst case, where families will simply leave a child to die. Moving on to India and Nepal briefly, this pervasive victim blaming culture is again disproportionately affecting women. This is further entrenched by the cultural context of religion and caste systems, and another prominence of supernatural beliefs surrounding facial differences. For instance, there's a belief that a cleft is caused by a mother using a knife during an eclipse, which is again made worse by health education, which can be very poor, specifically in remote areas where we witnessed communities refusing to touch people with skin conditions like vitiligo for fear of contagion, despite vitiligo being very much a non-contagious autoimmune condition. We then saw the failure of governments to provide necessary care, again with that gap between disability status. So all in all, that was a very quick and condensed version of a year-long project. And our first kind of step into better understanding the experience of stigma and also thinking about effective ways to build interventions to reduce stigma too, together with our partner organisations. There are lots of parallels here that we would love to delve into, but hopefully I've contextualised the issue a little bit here and the synergies with other stigmatised identities, so that we can kind of collectively move forward and use this session to consult with yourselves. I'm now going to hand over to the experts and hear from my fellow panelists on their expertise. So my first question to each of the panelists is, how does your experience as a person with a facial difference intersect with other social identities that you hold? I'm going to start with Rashira.
Thank you, Philida, for that really insightful introduction into why we're here today to have this conversation. And I think this ties beautifully into how my lived experiences and identities as a Black woman intersect in how I also live with a facial difference. Oftentimes, when I'm speaking to audiences, I do distinctly separate that I'm a person who lives with a disability, and I also have a facial difference and a chronic illness. And all of these are often considered within the medical community as rare diseases. My specific condition, Golden Heart Syndrome, it's reported that 1 out of 25,000 people have this condition. And so it is considered a rare disease, like I said. And as a result of this condition, I was born with external and internal birth defects and anomalies. When people generally meet me, they see that my ear is deformed. And I'm using this for context. I typically do not use the word deformity in my everyday language just because of the negative connotation, but I am aware of the audience, and so deformity or difference, you may hear me use those terminologies simultaneously. And so when most people meet me, they notice that my ear is different and that my face is a little crooked and it's asymmetrical. As a Black woman, I thought it was interesting what you said, Philida, about a lot of that burden, that cultural burden is placed on women. And I definitely can say my identity as being a Black woman has largely been impacted in me having a facial difference and a disability, and just some of the social stigma and pressures often Black women experience. And when it comes to appearance, when it comes to identifying what is beautiful, we hear terminology such as Barbie or Black girl magic, and how all of these archetypes do not follow the mode of someone who has a facial difference. And so that clashes a lot. And also identity as someone who is a person of faith and identifies as being a Christian. And so again, Philida, as you were saying, a lot of those religious beliefs around facial differences and deformities being caused by supernatural effects or origins of sin, those are also things that I have learned to combat in the stigma and to deconstruct on facial differences and anomalies. My specific condition is not genetically caused. It was literally a phenomenon that happened in the womb. And so that can be really troubling for people, because oftentimes you look for something to blame or want to look for a result or a cause, and I don't have any. And so often when I stand in faith-based places or places in work environment or socially, it is a lot of me having to educate people on, I have a facial difference and a disability. I don't really know why. This is why I was born the way I am, but this is how I'm showing up and looking. And so that's kind of a little context and how my social identities impact my everyday living and having a disability and a facial difference. I will say my background is in public health. I have a master's in public health from Morehouse School of Medicine, and then I recently started a PhD doctoral program here at Northern Arizona University. And so a lot of my research entails looking at the intersectionality and social stigma too of women with disabilities, and more specifically, women of color with disabilities. And so I think being on this platform today, among other people who are identifying as women and gender minorities, is really important to amplify. And so I will pass it on to my colleague, Marissa.
Great. Thank you for that. So, like I said before, I'm a Mexican American woman with a facial difference. So, I think my identities are something that influence my experience of stigma because there is almost always some ambiguity in this situation when experiencing stigma. So, because of all the identities I hold, they are always present and maybe impacting others' perceptions of me. So, I think if someone is stigmatizing towards me, I may not have a clear idea of why I was necessarily targeted. And so I won't know if it's like because of my age or my facial difference or gender or race or any of those identities. So there's no clear indication. So I think that puts a large emphasis on how I then interpret these experiences. And that uncertainty makes it difficult to deal with. And I think that is the same for many people with multiple minoritized identities. So experiences like this are something that led me to pursue research that could address this ambiguity. Because the same as Bashira, I'm also a PhD student. I'm a PhD student in health psychology at Oregon State University. So I'm currently researching intersectional experiences for people with disabilities in general to see what these stories people are telling themselves are and to see if this impacts how they're coping with stigma or discrimination. Yeah, I will also now pass it on to Dr. Gray.
Thank you. I'll echo what those of my colleagues have said, and I just want to maybe shift it a little bit, because one of the things that I really appreciated in the earlier session on stigma was Dr. Carrie Lessard, and she talked about this idea when it comes to stigma that culture is healing. And I think Renee, and she was talking about it from a Native American perspective, and I think it's true for me as a Black woman with a facial difference, that as much as I face stigmatization because of my differences, my culture has given me a level of resiliency. It has come from the experiences of Black people in the United States specifically, and the ways in which we have those continually faced dehumanization, and yet we refuse to allow society to determine our quality of life or the worth or value that we have, and our right to be here and the responsibility we have to our communities. And so I think carrying all of these different identities with me, as much as it is creating for society these multiple stigmatizing identities and multiple ways in which I can be othered, for me, they have come together as fingers on a fist almost, and have made me that much stronger. And that resiliency is what allows me to face each day in the fight toward addressing systemic issues that our community faces.
I think that's a brilliant segue into the next question as well, Jazz, where we're trying to frame this in comparison with synergies with other potentially stigmatized identities. So my next question, I guess, is what are the parallels, but also the differences? So how does facial difference stigma relate to other health-related stigmas such as HIV? What are the differences? What are the synergies? Who wants to jump in first? I can see Rashira smiling. Go on, jump in.
I think there are so many similarities and, like you said, so many differences. And I think this is often the tension that develops, especially in larger disability spaces when you're looking at disability in an overall umbrella and then the specific conditions under the disability umbrella. And it kind of relates to the same framework when you're looking at specific health conditions that experience social stigma and the specific stigma that each condition may face. the stigma I experience as a person with a facial difference is going to look and feel a lot differently than someone who has the stigma of HIV or another health condition that is considered to be taboo in our society. And so I'm learning, and I have learned as a person with lived experience, as an advocate, and as a researcher, that we have to create space, safe and brave spaces for both tensions to coexist, and not minimalizing the experience of others, but also validating and affirming that those stigmas and tensions exist, and that there may be different ways in which we can address and mitigate some of those experiences. We do know that people with facial differences and deformities, there's a unique experience, and it's mostly central to our appearance, and a lot of our appearances are focally centered. We know from studies in psychology that there is something about the face that it stands out. It is our earmark. It is our print of DNA. It is how we show up in society. And so oftentimes, in my experience, and I'm pretty sure my other colleagues, I don't want to speak for you, but you can attest that there is a level, I think, Marissa, you alluded to this earlier, there's a level of uncertainty because unlike other physical conditions that may affect your body, oftentimes we're not able to hide our faces. And so there's a level of uncertainty, confusion, and also what I've encountered is due to our community also being a minority within the disability community. There's a level of ambiguity and undereducation about exactly what facial differences are and what they look like. I know for me specifically, it's 1 out of 25,000. So I lived 25 years of my life without meeting another individual with golden hair syndrome. If you contextualize that, that means that everyone else in my community has also went a majority of their lives without meeting another individual or person who either looks like me or has a specific condition or a facial difference. And so that level of stigma is a little different than when you're meeting someone who may have a more common disability or health condition such as HIV or cerebral palsy or sickle cell. Some of these conditions that are often invisible and not necessarily seen, the level of stigma and the uncertainty behind that stigma can be confusing for some people. And so like Philida, you stated, there are some parallels, but there are some specific conditions. And I encourage all researchers, practitioners, and people who we even abide in community with just to be really cognizant of that, and realizing too that with each condition, we also have to check our own bias and our own relational attitudes and perceptions attached to each of those stigmas and those conditions. So I will stop there, and anyone else want to chime in?
I think about and just to relate to some of the, I really enjoyed the earlier session. I'm going to try to catch some more sessions as well. That one of the similarities, and then I think it ties that to something Rashir was saying about differences. So I think what I appreciated is those facial differences, and whether we're talking about HIV, there was also a session on substance use. And there's this idea society has of what's normal. And then there's the ways in which you do not fit what society deems as normal, as appropriate, is how you should be. And it's that word that normality and that should, that for all of us makes us, we're the outsiders. And so I think in each group, there's this like, this trying to fit into what society says versus the ways in which through an identity development, through different avenues, we're pushing back against what society says is normal or accepted. And so I think that is a similarity. I think for us, in terms of facial difference, it becomes a very visible representation of difference, and the idea of what it means to fit in society means you're surgically cutting and bleeding and having all these physical things that happen to you in order to try to fit a narrow standard of what's beautiful, a narrow standard of even the ways in which symmetry becomes a synonym for good. So you're trying to now fit into what's good by your physical appearance. And so I think there's a theme of us sort of nuancing what it means to be normal. And we do that in the ways in which we're intention with surgery and with a old school disability model versus more progressive ways of seeing our identity and our worth in society.
Yeah, I think you sum that up perfectly. And I have in my notes here about what we wanted to get across here is that normal is a loaded word. And you hit on the issue of plastic surgery there, which I think is really important to bring across, because we all live in a looks obsessed society with increasing accessibility to cosmetic treatment. And for someone with a facial difference who is likely going to have their kind of experience of said treatment throughout their life, which may be medically necessary, there is this grey area between what is medically necessary to be able to eat, to be able to breathe safely, versus what is purely aesthetic, and then what is necessary perhaps from a psychosocial standpoint as well, all very much pressured and reinforced by this societal pressure, as you were saying, about symmetry. And this is where I think there's a really interesting kind of, I guess, unique experience when it comes to facial difference, which is that there is not a cure. And as much as general society might believe that plastic surgery can cure everything, one, people probably do not want it, and we should not have any sense of a cure or this unhelpful narrative of being fixed forced upon us. But two, it's just totally unrealistic. Scars, for example, will always be something that many people with a facial difference will just live with. And this is where efforts to reduce stigma, for example, which might exist around other health stigmas like HIV, like leprosy, for example, neglected tropical disease, which are very much focused on increasing awareness or access to medication, that does not exist with facial difference. And anything that focuses too heavily on said cure or said idea of people needing to be fixed just perpetuates the stigma and makes it a whole lot worse. I will quit my rant there and hand over to Marissa, because there are a couple of other themes that we wanted to hit on for this question.
Yeah, so as someone who studies disability generally, but also facial difference as specific, I have found using the models of disability very useful to look at similarities between facial difference with other forms of health-related stigma. So if we look at the medical model of disability, which we've been kind of talking about this whole time, it views disability as like the result of biological abnormalities or pathology. And the responsibility of treatment is on the person with the disability and their medical professionals and like social support, their social support group. So if we apply this to people with facial differences, like we've been saying in the medical model, there's pressure to receive treatment through surgery to become more normal, which that word is loaded, like we've been saying. So then a stigma reduction solution is surgical treatment and whatever other medical treatments we might be recommended to have in this view. And this can apply to many other types of health conditions where medical treatment is viewed as like a stigma reduction strategy under the medical model of disability. But this is kind of missing out on a key point, where if we address issues surrounding stigma from the social model of disability, then we'd be viewing society as creating the issue of stigma, and therefore creating interventions to address structural stigma would be like the treatment in that case. So we tend to focus on the social model in my research and in advocacy, but both models are kind of not complete without the other. They both address certain things that we really need to focus on. So especially if we take an intersectional viewpoint, there is a privilege in being able to receive medical treatment and not have to experience health disparities, or at least eliminate that as much as possible. But there's also the social side of that experience that goes unaddressed if we just use the medical model. So these considerations apply for people with facial differences, but also just general health-related stigmas as well.
Thank you, Marissa. And I think another important theme to draw upon with this question is very much based around the title of this conference. So who can I tell? And you might assume that the disclosure versus non-disclosure piece is less relevant for something that is so visible. We can see facial difference. And yet there is increasing research around how troubling, how challenging it can be to talk about this stuff when it comes to meeting someone new, when it comes to entering into the workplace, whether it comes to dating, and it can be incredibly challenging. And I guess disclosure of facial difference and talking about it is something that cannot be disregarded as well. And I guess that as an effective method of reducing stigma in society is really important. So increasing positive representation, for example. Were there any other themes that anyone else wanted to hit on this question? I'll take that as no, and I will go on to the next question, which is about structural stigma. So what are some of the policies and systems that exist in society that are reinforcing facial difference stigma right now? Who wants to go first?
That one. And of course, if anyone wants to chime in, but I always like to create a space of relevancy, because when we think about structural stigma, that is a really large terminology. And so let's make this relevant. We all just came out of the pandemic, and in some areas are still experiencing COVID outbreaks. And one of the first things that I think about when looking at how structural stigma continues to be reinforced, specifically within the facial difference community, were mask wearing policies. We had this mandate nationally, and in some states it went on longer than others, that it was required to wear a mask in public. But for people with facial differences, that can stand as a barrier, because for a person like me, I have ear deformities, and so I'm not able to wear the loops around my ears that are centered on masks. And then also for people who have different and varying types of facial differences, the mask may not fit, or they may not properly be placed on the face, and up to regulation or standard in which the policy is required. And so this was something that public health professionals did not think about when in deciding to make mask wearing a policy, and weighing, is this worth the risk to public health and even individual health, and how that, like I said, it stood as a barrier and lack of accessibility for many people with facial differences. But not only on the negative side, but also how it proved to be kind of, I would say, a positive protectant for people with facial differences. There were many studies and opinion pieces that came out during the pandemic that said people with facial differences, they felt more comfortable going out in public wearing masks, those who were able to, because it mitigated that stigma, that social stigma, that we all look the same behind the mask. No one can tell that I have a facial difference or a scar. And so that level of public and social ambiguity, it removes that barrier of stigma that would initially come without the mask. And so we see like this polarizing effect that happened on a structural level with people with facial differences. And then other levels of structural stigma can also, we have the ADA, which is also known here in the US, American with Disabilities Act. And within that law, we have something that I like to refer to as the perception clause, in which it says that not only people with physical or mental impairments are protected under the ADA, but also people who are perceived to have disabilities. And oftentimes people with facial differences and disabilities, we are perceived to have intellectual incompetence, to cognitive disabilities, you know, a lot of that stigma, especially in the workplace. I can recall many instances in the workplace where I was verbally discriminated against because people assume that I had a disability or a cognitive disability because of my ear deformity or my face. And there are countless and thousands of other individuals with facial differences who have those same experiences. And so when we look to laws like the ADA, even though there is a protection there, oftentimes that legal protection does not act as a sure, absolute barrier against social stigma. And so how we often have to reinforce the law, not only in public policy, but also in behavioral and social interaction as well. And so if anyone else has any thoughts on that as far as how social stigma addresses people.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rashir. I'm taking notes. I had to take notes when Rashir speaks. One of the things that you said earlier that I want to segue, two things you said. One related to NASC, and the second one was related to this idea of going into the employment field. So what was interesting to me in looking at that research about NASC wearing is the research that also says, as much as we were in some ways normalized by the NASC wearing, when given the option to take it off, many of us were saying, I'm going to take it off. And there's several different implications that can be made from that, but one of them is the ways in which we are choosing to say, I will not, I'm going to hold society accountable. I am not going to hide myself in order to try to fit in. I'm going to walk into these spaces, these social spaces, these structural spaces, fully as who I am, and I'm going to expect the structure to shift because I am here. And I think that that was such an important finding, and I think that relates to structure. To segue to your second point, in terms of employment in particularly. So for me, I come from a media and entertainment background. So when I was younger, I wanted to be a performer. I was going to be a dancer, actress / singer. I was going to do it all. And I quickly found myself a part of a system, an employment system, and a cultural system in terms of entertainment that in these overlapping systems did not have a place for people who looked like me. And so what that meant was not only was I outside of a valuable form of employment to be able to economically support myself and to excel and have a high quality of life, but I was also outside of a cultural institution that was then taking, sorry, lights go off automatically, that was then taking these societal barriers and broadcasting them and perpetuating them throughout the world. So there's these two, for me, overlapping systems in terms of this cultural system, which I know we'll segue to in a little bit, in terms of entertainment, but the ways in which, in more practical terms, that impacts these economic systems, because the people who are doing the hiring, the people who have a say-so on who works what jobs are impacted by these false perceptions of who we are. So there's research that says that people with facial differences are seen as less competent. There's research that says people expect to have to, okay, this person's going to cost me money because they're going to have surgery and they're going to have to step away from their job and all of the burden I'm going to have to face if I hire this person. All of those perceptions have a institutional and a structural impact on our capacity to live and exist.
And that research in itself, in its very existence, can be stigmatizing, can't it? And at the moment, the onus is too much on that medical model of research. Marissa, was there anything you wanted to add on structural stigma or policies that are reinforcing stigma for facial difference right now?
I think I could just talk briefly about like it within academia and higher education as a structure, because I think both of the panelists mentioned previously, like kind of being perceived as less competent. And I think when we then try and go into do research in higher academia so that we can get these findings and use them for like intervention and things like that, we are then viewed as incompetent. And especially because there is this view within research that if you're studying an in-group, where you're studying kind of yourself in a way, you're studying a group that you are a part of. So like we have facial differences and then we do research on people with facial differences. There is like an inherent bias there, which people believe makes our research less than compared to other people who don't do that necessarily. But I think this is a bit of a bias in and of itself, because I think on some level we are researching ourselves most of the time, even if we're not studying like we're someone with a facial difference who has a facial difference. So I think that is kind of a structural belief that is put into how we educate everyone in terms of research, is that there is this bias if you study yourself. And then that's inherently putting our research like to be perceived as lower than other people, which is kind of a way that people can then disenfranchise people with facial differences and other types of health-related stigma who are then trying to do research on that same health-related stigma. So I think that's one way within academia and higher education that we're kind of structurally keeping people out of that. And if you want to go against it, you're constantly kind of fighting against those beliefs. But yeah, I very much agree with what my panelists said previously as well. Very pervasive.
A final point, which I'll mention briefly before the final question, which is just about ugly laws, which you may or may not be already aware of, but these are laws that existed in the US and in the UK up until the 70s, effectively stating that people that were deemed unsightly, perhaps conflating people who were homeless with people who were disabled, were criminalized for being seen out on the streets. The hangover, the legacy of these laws is very much to date the reinforcement of people being hidden away. As I alluded to earlier, there are still parts of the world where people born with facial differences, babies, are physically hidden away. What we see in the UK, in Europe, in the US, is a complete and utter lack of representation of people with facial differences across our screens, across advertising, and a lack of opportunity. And that, I guess, is a really helpful segue into the next question, which is about the role of media. So what is the role of media in relation to the public stigma of facial difference?
Yes, that's the role of media is as a powerful cultural force. The media, those regurgitates or gives that to us as a society, what we think about ourselves. And so all of the stigma, all of the ideologies that exist in society in terms of stigmatized identities, particularly those with facial differences, are then taken, put into these fictionalized worlds, and then rebroadcast to us as another form of reality. And we, as a society, then internalized those ideologies and carry them out in our behavior and in our interactions with other people. That ends up having at least 3 different dimensions that should be discussed in terms of media. 2 of them fall in to a category called symbolic annihilation. And even in that word annihilation, you hear the ending of a thing, the obliteration of a thing. And so symbolic annihilation is a term we use in media studies to talk about the ways in which stigmatized and other marginalized identities are dehumanized. And that can happen in at least two different ways. So the first is through erasure, which is the absence of our identities in media. So there is an overwhelming lack of media representation of people with disabilities in general, and even less for those of us with facial differences than seen and shown in media to begin with. And that's a way of saying when you are not even present in a fictionalized version of reality, is a way of saying you do not matter. You do not exist in this world the world of our imaginations. You don't exist. So obviously that is a huge issue. And then paired with that is the issue of media misrepresentation. So in the few times that you will see a person with a disability, particularly one with a craniofacial or other facial difference, they are represented in ways that are stigmatizing, and that could look like being seen as villains. It can look like being seen as these morally gray characters. It can look like being seen as outcasts and as those who are not fit for society in some way. For those of us with facial differences, the villain trope becomes the stable way in which we are seen. And that has to do in some ways with this idea of semiotics. So when a content creator wants to create a film and they want to portray a character flaw or a person's personality, they're going to do that using symbols. So things stand for other things. And unfortunately, scarring has been used by media content creators to stand for bad, to stand for evil, to stand for scary. And so they use scarring because it becomes an easy way to signal the audience that there's either something internally wrong with the character or there's something that the audience should feel that's negative when they see that character. And of course, it's not intentional, that it doesn't change the impact that has on those of us who stand at that intersection, whose lives hang in the balance of these misrepresentations. And then the last thing I'll talk about is something that's dear to my heart. I think it's where our advocacy should and is going, and that's media participation. The reason why you have the issue of erasure and the reason why you have the issue of misrepresentation is largely because there are not people behind the scenes in roles of influence and power that look like us. The more you open the doors of any employment, but particularly entertainment employment, to those who have disabilities in general and disfigurement in particular, the more you will be able to see a shift and a change in the way we are portrayed in the media, and thus the way that what society is said about who we are.
Beautifully put. Absolutely, yeah. Just, and that's why you do what you do, and that's why you're a professor in what you do. Thank you, Jazz. I think, to reiterate, 9 times out of 10, when you see someone with a facial difference, when you see someone with a scar on our screens right now, it is the baddie, it is the vulnerable person. And you're right, it's because no one throughout that entire multi-million-dollar process had the ability to stick their hand up and say, this is a bit problematic, like, should we maybe not do that, and basically disregard an entire community, and then lead to the fact that children are directly referred to as these names in schools, like Freddy Krueger, like the Joker. It has a knock-on impact in day-to-day life, as we've seen with other stigmatized identities, when issues are misrepresented in the public eye, it directly leads to further marginalization, abuse, you name it. Any other contributions there on the role of the media before we jump into the section where we're going to hear from the audience and hopefully consult with some experts on where we go next? Any other final thoughts from the other panelists? You just did such a good of summing it up beautifully, Jazz. Okay, so this is the section where we want to hear from the experts at this conference. We're really, excited to be here to deepen your understanding in the unique experiences of the facial difference community. But what's most important is we want to understand the way that this intersects with other minoritized identities and where there could be synergy for intervention. So for this reason, we want to open up the chat box for any questions to the panelists. First and foremost, do you have any questions for us? Is there anything that we skirted over or didn't delve into enough that you want to hear from this group of experts? Can we help to explain this issue further? Please use the chat box to ask us questions, but then we also have questions for you. So for example, can anyone who has watched this immediately think of perhaps an effective intervention to reduce stigma surrounding facial difference? And our particular interest is public stigma, is structural stigma as opposed to internalized stigma. So how can we effectively build interventions? And with that in mind, how can we reach certain communities within this as well? So how can we effectively reach people of color living with a facial difference as well? I'm just going to read out what's coming into the chat box as it comes. So great dialogue, very informative. Thank you for sharing your stories. Thank you. And then so enlightening. This is good. Does anybody in the participants have any questions for the panelists or any ideas that are up for discussion in terms of potentially helpful interventions to reduce facial difference stigma? Are there programs that we should be aware of that are directed towards wider disability stigma, for example, or health stigmas, HIV stigma as a whole that we should be looking at? Are there pieces of research that anyone thought, oh, we should go away and read that? We're all ears. And if we don't get questions, then we'll just continue to ramble on because we could be here for hours sharing our experiences. Another area.
I'll ask a question while we're waiting on the questions to roll on in from the audience. I'm a professor, so I'm cool with awkward silence. So I will usually with my students, I will just sit here in silence and give everybody time to think about their questions. But obviously on the panel, they're not as effective an approach. So I'll ask a question, and then hopefully anyone who's on and has a question, it could be for us as researchers. We each come from different backgrounds: entertainment, health and health policy, or about our personal experiences with facial difference. Because I know as we mentioned, for some people, this may be your first time even hearing someone or seeing someone with a facial difference. So maybe your questions are more geared toward our personal experiences, and that's fine too. So please don't hesitate to pop a question or two in the chat. I would like to ask a question related to Marissa's point about academia. Knowing, and the question is to Rashira, because as I was thinking about the opportunity that we have today, which is such an important space to be talking to academics, to be at a conference associated with Howard University, who from our identity as Black people and Black women, Howard is such an influential institution. And at the same time, we know that the reason why the Stigma Conference exists is because even at Howard, there's this understanding that not everyone is accepted. And I think you have a unique perspective, Rashira, as someone who has attended and worked with HBCU and other Black spaces, about speaking to the conversation that we touched on earlier about the intersectionality piece, and possibly some of the challenges as well as opportunities that exist in trying to have this kind of conversation across the race and disability.
Yeah, I think that is a loaded question. Like we said, normal is a loaded phrase, and this is a loaded question because there's so many areas just within Black culture, within HBCU culture, within disability culture, that they're all coming in and intersecting. And I think this is where the framework and lens of intersectionality really has to be applied. You know, as a researcher, when I'm thinking of intersectionality, I'm often looking into the margins of those or people in communities who are even marginalized within their own community. And like I said earlier, the facial difference community is a margin within the disability community and even has intersecting threads when it relates to that. And so, you know, I graduated from Morehouse School of Medicine with my master's in public health. And I was not aware of the level of medical ableism and academic ableism I was anticipating to experience until I got there. I always like to say when I'm speaking in audiences, and especially cultural specific audiences, that we are not omitted as a community and as a culture to also understand the layers of intersectionality and how that impacts people. Because although us culturally as a people, and Jazz, I believe you mentioned this earlier when speaking of the community of Native Americans, even though culturally as a people, we have experienced disenfranchisement, marginalization, there are even people within our communities who face that at a more significant rate. This is often called multiple marginalization or called a double jeopardy effect. And so when I'm speaking to especially Black specific spaces and emphasizing the need for intersectionality and the need for inclusion, that they're not only Black people, but they're Black disabled people who deserve their presence and their inclusion in these spaces. And I think that's something traditionally and culturally that we have to progress towards, because oftentimes disability, even within Black culture, has been weaponized. You know, there was a point in history that being Black was considered a disability. And so now that we have advanced and we have grown from that type of model, you know, putting the onus on institutions, on HBCUs, on predominantly Black spaces and platforms to see, yes, we are advancing, we are arising, we are healing as a community. But where are the areas, even in the community, where are the pockets of people that are still experiencing stigma and marginalization? And I believe, you know, even this conference on stigma and reaching the HIV population, it just shows that there was the reason why there is attention to that, because during the HIV pandemic, and this is kind of to give some historical and structural context, is because there were so many African Americans in our community and still in our community who are facing the conditions of living with HIV and AIDS and how that has real-time stigma. But there are still hundreds and thousands of us who are living with disabilities. And if you want to go even deeper, HIV and AIDS is considered a type of disability. And so I think we have to be really cognizant of that. I know conversations like these, it is really new and it can be very jarring because some of you may not experience interacting with people with facial differences. But as researchers, as practitioners, as organizational leaders, I really do want to encourage you to look into the pockets of your own cultural specific community and look into those margins to see, you know, we always say who is at the table, But an even bigger question that we can ask is who is not at the table, you know, and making sure all voices are represented in this space. And so I'm proud as a Black woman to even be excited to be in this space and to have this conversation, because there's a lot of work to be done. But I want to make sure that we are putting onus on institutions, and especially Black predominantly spaces, that we're thinking more in-depthly and more critically and intersectional, most important, about who is not in the space, who are the most marginalized, who are multiply marginalized, and making sure that we are reaching those people as well.
You're totally right to raise that, Rashira, and it's important to say that we represent a very, small representation of the lived experience of this very diverse community, and we all are relatively privileged in a sense to be here, to be part of this community, to have space, and it's really important, particularly from an organizational standpoint at Face Equality International, that we do everything we possibly can to reach the most underrepresented, underserved members of the community, which was very much one of the inspirations behind our most recent Stigma project, focusing on loads of middle-income countries where anecdotally we were hearing the most extreme examples of human rights violations, and yet you go to find some research about it, let alone some interventions that have been developed to address these human rights violations, and they simply do not exist. So there's a lot of work to be done, and there's a lot of redistribution of power that needs to be done. We have about 6 minutes left. I wonder, we have a comment in the chat box. From a provider perspective, it is noted that people are so different. What are the preferred words to use when addressing someone with a facial difference? Does this term facial difference also include skull malformations as well? Please tell us terms we can use as providers that would not be insulting. Really important question, and something that we would always encourage you to take the individual's lead, allow someone to self-identify with their preferred terms, because this stuff can change obviously from culture to culture, from country to country. Facial difference is a relatively new and emerging kind of umbrella term that we hear a lot in the US. That said, other terms that have come up throughout this conversation are disfigurement, deformity, visible difference. Visible difference and facial difference are generally the more neutral terms. Deformity, disfigurement, they can have some inherently negative connotations, but they are generally the more medical or legally recognized terms. So go with facial difference. If you're unsure, go with facial difference, and also just ask. Do my fellow panelists feel I made that point, or do you have anything else to add?
You made that point. I just want to add that listening into the earlier session, that the same questions about terminology, it was endearing to hear, like, we're not the only community whose language and terminologies are changing and evolving, and we're pushing for language that's neutral and represents us. And so I thank you so much, Joanna, for that question. It's as a provider, I'm appreciative that you all are thinking in terms of what terminology is going to connect to people that you could be seeing in your as clients and patients.
Yeah. We have another potentially quite loaded question, which people might want to answer either personally or from the research, because it's quite personal. But someone asked about how do you negotiate dating. Does anyone want to answer? I mean, I have a whole host of stories. Be here for hours, but it might end up being not so appropriate for a conference. Does anyone have anything that they want to share? I mean, from a research collective standpoint, this is an issue. As we alluded to earlier, the disclosure point is really important, and this group here represents facial differences that are on our faces, but of course visible differences, skin conditions, burns, they might be present on a person's body too. So intimacy can be challenging. Dating platforms, dating websites, apps can be really challenging because they, reinforce that very appearance focused narrative. Even Tinder now uses an artificial intelligence tool to tell you which photographs you should have on your profile. And facial recognition software, we know, does not work for people with diverse faces. And that's a whole other different area of discrimination that we could plan an entire panel around. So to answer the question, dating is a real challenge for many people with facial differences, but also for many people it's absolutely fine and they find partners, and it can be a great filter for people that are not worth our time. So it can actually be quite an empowering thing because it can filter out the people that are solely interested in a perfect, in inverted commas, appearance. Anyone have anything else to add on that point?
I think there can also be a whole conference on dating. Suggestion for conference creators.
yeah. But it's a really, really important question. Okay, well, we have 1 minute left. So with that in mind, first off, a massive thank you to my fellow panelists. It's great to be working alongside each of you, a total honor, and we are doing such good work, and it fills me with hope to be surrounded by such intelligent women. So thank you to each of you, and then thank you to everybody who has watched along this whole time. We've had about 20 people the whole time, which is really great to see. Please do stay in touch. If you suddenly have a question or an idea for an intervention, something to do off the back of this, get in touch via Face Equality International or search for my panelists, who are all searchable through their academia. So thank you, everybody. I will pause it there and hopefully see some of you at the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.